Thank you. It's nice to be back. I was here 10 years ago, flogging a different book, and it's a wonderful place to be. I love the barn, I love the house, and I've had a chance to spend some time in it and get lost in it. And it's wonderful. Thank you for being here. This is a book with an interesting history. Even the history of our new edition is interesting. In the early 1960s, which were the high and palmy days of editions of American authors, plans were first drawn up for what was then the Iowa edition of the works of Mark Twain. The story of how California got the series away from Iowa is one that I won't have time to go into now. Pudd'n'head Wilson was then assigned to editor Arlen Turner of Duke University. And Turner's research produced one good journal article and nothing more. And he retired without having gotten anywhere with an edition. In the 70s, an edition was prepared for the Iowa series, which by then was the Iowa-California series. But the edition did not receive the approval of the editor of the Mark Twain papers, and it did not appear in the Works series. It was subsequently re-edited and published as a Norton Critical edition and has been in print since 1980. The assignment for the Iowa edition, so-called, was next passed to Herschel Parker. Herschel is an eminent scholar and textual critic with a great interest in Mark Twain, as well as Melville and other writers. Parker published several papers and a book chapter on the textual history of Pudd'n'head, and the conclusion he came to was that it was so tangled that Pudd'n'head Wilson could not be edited. This made his position as editor awkward, and he resigned. Many years passed, and in 2017, when Bob Hurst, general editor of the Mark Twain papers, consulted the other editors as to what we ought to edit next, I said Pudd'n'head Wilson. One of my fellow editors said, "You've got to be kidding." But it was an opportunity not to be missed. Among Mark Twain's books, this one has been steadily rising in importance since at least the 1950s, and is now now maybe at peak importance. Let me see if this works. How does this, ooh. Which part of you clicks? Oh. Speaking of the 1950s, Pudd'n'head's place in the canon was not any too highly rated at that time. This 50s paperback, well, you can see it's a 50s paperback, gave it the more saleable title of The Unnatural Son, the story of a sordid scandal that rocked a Mississippi River town. This was published in a series that also included titles such as Savage Mistress and Dope Doll. One of the most noticeable facts about our new edition is that it presents not one but three texts. The text of the manuscript. Have I a pointer? Yes? Oh, of course. Thank you. The text of the manuscript, which is in the J.P. Morgan Library in New York. The text of the revised Pudd'n'head Wilson, so-called, reconstructed and freed from the magazine's editorial changes, and the text of Those Extraordinary Twins, which is Mark Twain's assemblage of passages which he deleted from the original manuscript when he was revising. Waste not, want not. He got a whole extra publication out of the parts of the book he had deemed inadequate. Why the three different texts? I'm going to explain that by taking you through Pudd'n'head Wilson's textual origin story, which, I warn you, is a complicated one, and I don't particularly dumb it down at all. In 1892, the Clemenses were in dire financial straits. At that time, this meant you had to go live in the finest hotels all over Europe. It did. You didn't have to, but you could. And this was how the Clemenses managed it. The exchange rate was so favorable that I think it was, you got something like 5 English pounds to $1. And the other European currencies were similar. So the Clemenses, to save money, literally lived in the Hotel Metropole and so forth all over for 10 years, all over Europe. Today, conditions for bankrupts have improved, and they hardly ever have to rebuild their fortunes in this way. But in 1892, Clemens made a short trip back to the US, and there he saw a picture. It was a picture, not necessarily these pictures, but something like it, of the Tocci brothers. The Tocci brothers were conjoined twins from Italy who were being exhibited in America in dime museums. Clemens was fascinated by twins and by the comic possibilities of two people sharing a single body. Today we tend to think of such cases as two individuals, but the 19th century saw them as being on a hilarious borderline between one person and two. The Tocci brothers are the famous two-headed boy of dime museum fame. When Clemens got back to Germany, he began a story, a fantasia inspired by these brothers. He said about it later, okay. What's going to happen on the screen is that a diagram is going to be gradually built up, showing the descent of the text through the various manuscripts and other witnesses. So for now, we have his first manuscript, the so-called Berg manuscript, because it's in the Berg collection in New York. He said about this first story, originally the story was called Those Extraordinary Twins. I meant to make it very short. I had seen a picture of a youthful Italian freak, or freaks, which was, or which were, on exhibition in our cities, a combination consisting of 2 heads and 4 arms, joined to a single body and a single pair of legs. And I thought I would write an extravagantly fantastic little story with this freak of nature for hero, or heroes, a silly young miss for heroine, and 2 old ladies and 2 boys for the minor parts. Mark Twain set his twins in pre-Civil War Missouri in a village exactly like Hannibal. And he put them through their paces, comically. They quarrel with each other. One is a Christian and one is a free thinker, and they have to get along in the single body and so forth. A typed version of that manuscript, TS1, was made while the Clemenses moved house to a villa in Florence. Once they were settled there, Clemens kept on elaborating the twins' adventures in new manuscript. A typed version of his bigger manuscript was made when the Clemenses moved to a villa in Florence, and once they were settled there, I think I already said that. That typescript became the kernel of a longer manuscript. This is the first completed version of Pudd'n'head Wilson, which was then still called Those Extraordinary Twins. This was the Morgan Manuscript. While developing the twins business, Clemens had invented a minor character, the village intellectual Pudd'n'head Wilson. And he created a storyline in which the twins get accused of a murder which Wilson can then solve. And this will display Wilson's prowess as a detective. The murder victim was going to be the local judge, and the twins would be successfully defended by Pudd'n'head Wilson. Clemens was carrying along with this story when he had a stroke of luck. His London publishers sent him a copy of a new book. This was Fingerprints by Francis Galton. In this book, Galton maintains that fingerprints are unique and could be used in crime detection. He was the first to point that out. Galton was, among other things, a founder of the science of genetics, also the science of eugenics. Clemens realized that Pudd'n'head Wilson had to employ this sensational new method of detection. It would dominate his big climactic courtroom scene. He wrote to his publishers, "The Fingerprints has just arrived, and I don't know how you could have done me a greater favor. I shall devour it." But it's really not that simple. Actually, what Galton had done was to give scientific treatment to something Mark Twain already knew a lot about. In Life on the Mississippi, which he had written 10 years earlier, there is a mystery that is unraveled by means of a thumbprint. So his murder mystery was now clear. But as he wrote on, Clemens realized that his subplot had as much meat on it as his main plot, or more. And he revised, expanding this subplot, which took on, as he never had before, the subjects of slavery, race mixing, and identity. A plot that turns upon nature and nurture. The phrase is one that Mark Twain does not use, but it was invented by Galton. This subplot is about a slave woman, Roxy, who is 1/16 black. Roxy has a newborn baby by a white man, and her owner, enslaver, has a new baby as well. To free her own son, who is 1/32 black and can pass for white, she switches the children in the cradles. Tom, her son, becomes the young master, and Chambers, who is really white, grows up a slave. Tom is the secret murderer of Judge Driscoll. Up to now in the writing, Clemens had simply had him killing the judge in the course of robbing him. Now, after revisions that he put in to make Tom part black, his crime takes on ambiguous qualities like revenge. In this presentation, by the way, I'm using illustrations from the magazine version, the book's first published form. And they're not the familiar illustrations at all. They're pretty unfamiliar. They're by Louis Loeb. I'll talk about them later. At this point, we can see Clemens shying away from a plot that would have been very strong meat for his readership and his publishers. As long ago as 1962, Henry Nash Smith observed that the natural bent of the story is in fact this, that Tom should avenge his fate as a mixed-race person, avenge it on his slave-owning, race-mixing father, and that this father would naturally be Judge Driscoll. And that's not what we find in the book we've read, where Judge Driscoll is Tom's uncle. Henry divined this from psychological premises, and he did not know that in the manuscript, Clemens had developed exactly that plot line and canceled it. But Clemens lost his nerve and gave Tom an absent father. Tom's father is accounted for, but only so as to get him accounted for. A non-character who is completely kept out of our view. But the revision was consequential enough without that detail. Clemens had created Tom, the villain of the piece, as a white man. Now that Tom was black, or partly black, the way was opened potentially to interpret his villainy as the result of his race. The question for us then becomes, what matters? What controls? The thing that was in the mind of the author when he wrote, or how the final product actually strikes us? It's a point that has been much debated, and the new edition ought to inform this debate. I don't suppose it will end it, but it will show what Clemens considered and what he rejected. With his main story all squared away, as he believed at that time, Clemens turned to the project of making maxims to go at the beginnings of the chapters, the famous Pudd'n'head Wilson's calendar. He had large collections of maxims in manuscript, and still today they guarantee his reputation as one of the greatest and most quoted and misquoted aphorists. He now realized that he could attribute these maxims to the character of Wilson, no matter what they said. Here are a few, though, and you're familiar with them, but here are a few that he generated for Pudd'n'head Wilson, but later removed from the manuscript. If you put 500 compliments into one scale and a censure into the other, which will weigh the most? When an election goes with us, we see and feel how intelligent this great nation is. When it goes against us, we see and feel how hard it is to make this great nation understand the issues. When in doubt, tell the truth. Clemens finished the Morgan Manuscript in January 1893, and then he had it typed there in Florence. The resulting typescript he sent to his publishing partner in New York. Livy, as we know from correspondence, was against publishing the story in this form, and she said, in any form. And Mark Twain became convinced that in its present form, it could not be published. That was a blow to him, because he badly needed money. And he began to revise. This has gotten turned into vers libre for some reason, and I don't know how that happened, but it's prose. Mark Twain tells us he had a sufficiently hard time with this book because it changed itself from a farce to a tragedy while I was going along with it, a most embarrassing circumstance. But what was a great deal worse was that it was not one story, but two stories tangled together. And they obstructed and interrupted each other at every turn and created no end of confusion and annoyance. In other words, the farce of the twins didn't go well with the dramatic plot he had now centered on Roxy. In his own words, Clemens pulled one of the stories out by the roots and left the other one, a kind of literary Caesarean operation. But it was not that simple. For on closer examination, the twins turned out to have quite strong connections to the other events of the book and could not be simply pulled out by the roots. In fact, if you tug at their thread, the whole story unravels. Clemens, pressed for time, settled on a quick fix. He removed from the typescript all the twins' material which he easily could and revised the conjoined twins into ordinary twins, ordinary aristocratic Italian twins who live in Missouri. As a result, most of the things the extraordinary twins had been exhibited doing were now less than extraordinary. In the manuscript, for example, they play four-handed piano. In the revision, they still play four-handed piano, but it is no longer worth mentioning. They still go everywhere in each other's company, even though they dislike each other's company. But to do otherwise would have meant more thorough revision than Clemens was willing to put into the book. And so forth. There's a great many of these so-called vestiges of the original Pudd'n'head Wilson in the published version. So here we had a box for the extracted twins material, the gray one there, which we will be seeing again later. Clemens also determined to, as he said, knock out everything that delayed the march of the story, even the description of a Mississippi steamboat. In the passage he refers to, Roxy, who has been given her freedom, goes for the first time aboard one of the floating palaces, and while it does not advance the story, it is a tour de force of descriptive writing. It's worth reading the Morgan Manuscript version for that passage alone. This engraving shows the steamboat Grand Turk, and this is the one Clemens was thinking of. I think it's a very important passage in a number of ways. Necessarily, Roxy's first view of the inside of the magnificent, and busy inside of a steamboat is also, of course, is patterned on Clemens's first glimpse of the inside of a steamboat, and it's of some interest. But the typescript was not revised by Clemens only. He submitted it to the Century magazine to be serialized there. And the Century editors, as was their right, technically, revised it as well. And this is where the editor, meaning me, the editor, this is where the editor's heartaches really begin. For it is the loss of this revised Clemens typescript that has posed the editorial problems I am about to share with you. Revised by Mark, so that thing, the typescript version, was revised by Mark Twain and then revised by the editors. It must have become a very complex looking document. This typescript is lost. Actually, to be exact, 3 leaves of it have survived and are in the Mark Twain papers. Clemens removed these leaves and forgot about them, and so they were in among his possessions when his possessions became the Mark Twain papers. As you can see, they are just scraps of text. Well, this one is a draft copyright page, and this one, these two are chapter beginnings with maxims. As you can see, he still had to revise them. These fragments gave us some useful information about the TypeScript, but the rest of it, as I've said, is lost. How could such an important, authorially revised literary TypeScript go missing? Well, this is actually typical of that time. Authors' manuscripts that had been used as printer's copy were not treated as relics. The manager of the press where the Century magazine was printed wrote in his memoirs that no one took the slightest interest in the fate of authors' manuscripts. Quote, "Once a month, all manuscripts, proof, and letters of instruction that had fulfilled the purpose for which they had been written were tied up in a bundle by the composing room and stowed away. If an author requested the return of his manuscript and proofs, of course he received them. Otherwise, everything, by whomever written, was taken to the vault below and dumped into huge burlap bags suspended from the ceiling. Periodically, a man lowered himself into the bags, perhaps lowering the bags first to the floor, and trampled down the contents solidly so as to get more literature into a bag, you see. Then the wastepaper merchant hauled them away after paying a cent or two a pound. And presumably that is what happened to the TypeScript. The Century magazine used it as printer's copy, and the magazine ran Pudd'n'head in 7 monthly installments in 1893-94. Clemens, who was in New York at the time, not principally to supervise publication of Pudd'n'head Wilson, but to attend to his other business interests, which were failing rapidly. And he corrected proofs at the magazine's office in New York. When the magazine serial was appearing, the London edition, that small red book, was being set in type using the magazine as copy. But then something peculiar happened. In the spring of 1894, so well before book publication, but when they were printing it up, the London printers ran out of copy because the final 2 installments of Pudd'n'head Wilson had not yet appeared in the magazine. And rather than wait for them, they appealed to what was left of Mark Twain's company, and they obtained, eventually, copy of some sort, and they went on printing. Why am I telling you that? It's interesting because whatever copy the London publisher received derived from the revised TypeScript with Clemens's revisions, but without the revisions of the Century magazine editors. Thus, once we had figured that out, we saw that it had a special value. In the final chapters of the book, the text of the London edition is purer and more authorial than any other printing until now. The magazine also served as a textual copy for the American edition of Pudd'n'head Wilson. But this American edition also contains another text, Those Extraordinary Twins, an old title newly applied to something else. It's applied now to a selection from the material Clemens excised from Pudd'n'head Wilson when he revised it. That is to say, the twins material. Clemens provided the American publisher with revised twins material he'd lifted out of the story. That completes the diagram of the text. For the editors, knowing all this is important. The manuscript and the published novel have thousands of variant readings between them. Am I supposed to be on another page now? I think I am. The key thing to realize is that not all of the Century magazine changes were Mark Twain's changes. It was 1893, the editors were producing a family magazine, and they saw themselves as the custodians of written style and of public morals. This is typical of the day. A Century editor described his magazine as being intent on good taste, the deletion of slang and coarseness, and the softening of all expressions or statements likely to offend. You can imagine what that does to a text by Mark Twain. the editors meant to remove all affected forms and stereotyped expressions. In his memoirs, Century editor Robert Underwood Johnson was completely impenitent. It was really pathetic to see the way authors would plead with us for another dam or for a well-known equivalent of the lower regions. He wrote that in 1923, and he still couldn't bring himself to write hell, even for an adult memoir reading audience. The Century magazine, in other words, transformed Mark Twain's texts along these lines. In hundreds of readings, which carried over into all the published editions, and which have now for the first time been detected, uprooted, and replaced with the wording of the original manuscript in our edition. It was, furthermore, important that the project published the Morgan Manuscript in another way, to publish an integral version of the Morgan Manuscript as a text on its own. That is true for several reasons. In the first place, the relationship of the manuscript to the novel that was later dug out of it has a central spot in the critical literature. Clemens started that himself, sort of an unforced error, when he published Those Extraordinary Twins along with a preface explaining his troubles writing the book. Also, the Morgan Manuscript version is not some kind of preliminary draft, which is how it has sometimes been described. I don't believe Clemens ever wrote a draft in his life. Until proven otherwise, his writing is always meant to be final, even if it later does get revised. He considered the manuscript finished and publishable until he was convinced otherwise. Furthermore, the manuscript has a special importance because it shows the novel as it was, right down to the last detail, when Clemens still had complete control over it. The published novel has been altered extensively by censors, magazine editors, and printing house workers. The idea of publishing the manuscript in this way, as a legitimate version of the novel, instead of as an appendix of some kind, has met with some resistance during the publishing process. Taking this step is certainly somewhat radical, but it is not as radical as it has seemed. Wordsworth's Prelude is just one work that is often published in editions containing both his original and his revised text. And anything Wordsworth can take, our boy can take double. Not all of Clemens's revisions to the typescript were geared towards solving his overarching narrative problems. It's clear that he made lots and lots of smaller scale revisions of the kind you would make whenever you go over your work and rewrite it. But the trick is to distinguish his revisions from somebody else's. In the picture here, you can see some of his revisions. That's easy. But we're talking here not about decontaminating the manuscript readings, which are fine, but decontaminating the published novel. The typescript, what this slide shows in a schematic way is the textual situation that we're in regarding Pudd'n'head Wilson. The typescript, it would be there. The typescript, if it had survived, would have had Clemens's revisions written on it, and they would have been easy to distinguish from other people's revisions written on it. But all that information is gone. It's gone into, as I call it, the black box. The black box is between the in case you can't tell, is between the manuscript and the Century magazine. It is a stage that's missing. It's the stage of the missing document. Only the Century magazine is an authoritative witness to Clemens's revisions. But since the Century also incorporates the errors of the typists, the revisions and the censorship of the Century, printing house errors, and corrections on proofs by the author, any variant between the manuscript and the magazine could be the work of the author, the typist, the magazine's editor, or the compositor. The compositor is the woman who sets the type. At the Century magazine, all of the compositors were women. These are the categories to which the editor aims to assign any dubious variant. How is it done? Well, it is not precisely a science, but it does use empirical knowledge of the author's habits, empirical knowledge of the habits of publishers and printers, psychology, and logic. Let's look at the editorial process in the form of a game. A couple of examples. At the top, you have the reading of M.S. Morgan, the manuscript. Then you have, on its way into history, it passes through the black box where there was a revising typescript, and below it, the familiar reading of the Century magazine and other books. Was Suffer altered to burn with Satan by the author, the typist, the editor, or the compositor? I'm really asking. Yell them out, yell it out.
Author.
Our survey said, yes, this can't be regarded as the answer, but it's the answer I came up with too. It's not like a typist or a compositor or an editor pretty much to simply render the writing more colorful. So yes, the author. Here is the next one. Sits in your midst, bang, gets turned into sits in, a very strange phrase, sits in among you. What do you think? What? I can't hear you. Editor? I agree. You're good at this. Yes, in this case, it positively is the editor. And how do we know? Because the Century magazine, like other magazines, had a style sheet which banned certain expressions. And in our midst was one of them. The style sheet specifically requires among, and among is what we find in the Century text. In this case, it has been put in very clumsily because they retained the word in and created this very peculiar phrase. This style sheet is a new discovery. I didn't find the style sheet itself, but I found a book that quoted from it extensively, gave a good long extract of the Century magazine's style sheet. So in this case, it's a moral certainty that you're looking at an editorial change. What about this one? And had them squirt out an imaginary fire, which became, and had them put out an imaginary fire. It's a simple change. Who would do that? The compositor? I say editor because I'm pretty sure this is editorial censorship. You might think that squirt was not a dirty enough word to get censored, but in 1893, I think there's lots of evidence that it was. In the Century's other publications of Mark Twain alone, we have seen them removing words like rot and hogwash and suppressing oaths like dern and by jings. And those came out of Huckleberry Finn when it was published in the Century magazine. And I don't think there's any doubt about who did it. Recently, I came across some more evidence along these lines where it's not common to have to come into contact with manuscript matter that was used to set copy, as I was explaining how with the burlap bags. But I came across something like that, and the editors at the Century had crossed out the word poop, which had been used not in that way, but to mean the sound made by a trombone, the poop of the trombone, and that was and apparently that was too strong for the Century magazine. So in our text, squirt is of course restored. Taking account of the role of censorship, is, in fact, one of the main contributions of the new edition. Here's an example. In the manuscript, Roxy says that her father was John Randolph of Roanoke, a Virginia aristocrat of the Jeffersonian period, a real one. And in the century text, we find Roxy's claim has been altered. Now, she fetches her ancestry from a more distant relative, Captain John Smith. Is this a change Mark Twain would have made? Clearly, he composed the revised texts. I don't think there's any doubt that he wrote both versions. But did he do the second one under editorial pressure? I think we have to assume that he did, that the century editors balked at the idea of giving John Randolph a mixed-race, illegitimate child, which he didn't, so far as I know, historically have. In the new text, that revision is treated as a censoring one, and the MS reading is allowed to stand. To discriminate between authorial and editorial changes, you need data about what the Century magazine tended to do. As I've mentioned, documents that served as printer's copy were destroyed. This one, however, is in the Mark Twain papers, a rare survival. It's the typescript of the 1 million pound banknote, which Clemens had published through the century, and which has been marked up by the printers and a century editor. And it furnishes real evidence for what the editors liked to do. It shows them doing it. Here they are. Here we see the editor's pencil changing spellings from trousers with a W, which is Clemens's invariable spelling, to trousers with a U. Spacing out contracted forms like couldn't, and canceling an underscore under give. Reparagraphing, and deleting and adding punctuation. Deleting whole words and phrases, and changing where sentences start and end. Here the and has been sort of loosely triple underscored to make it a capital, and it's not very clearly marked, and that's also typical of printing house work. And censoring the language. Here, damn is made into D dash. So I've been talking a lot about establishing the text and little else besides. But there are other ways that this volume contributes, and one of them is in discussing the play that was made from Pudd'n'head Wilson, which was more popular in its day than the book ever was, and the film adaptation, very early film adaptation. Pudd'n'head Wilson was made into a play by Clemens's friend Frank Mayo, who was a famous actor. It premiered in 1895. This is a poster from the original play production showing Frank Mayo in the title role, and I've already forgotten her name, Frances somebody, as Roxy. Not as Roxy. Wrong. The other one. I've tried to learn everything I can about the silent film. There's definitely room for a larger study to be done on this. It was released in 1916 and is lost. If this film weren't lost, it would be very famous. It was produced by Cecil B. DeMille and was the first in a series of Mark Twain features authorized by his literary estate. It was made in the immediate aftermath of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, probably in an effort to capture some of the racial paranoia market. We may be richer for having lost it, but it's still interesting to try to use what survives of it to work out what was in it. In this still, a publicity still, a mob has gathered to lynch Chambers, who is at Wilson's house. That doesn't happen in any version of Pudd'n'head Wilson, so obviously the plot is thoroughly changed. I gathered details about the film from newspaper reviews and accounts of the censorship imposed by the film boards of various cities. In those days, different cities had their own film censorship. Another movie still. Tom, with the mustache, is refusing to be fingerprinted by Pudd'n'head Wilson. This is Roxy behind Tom's shoulder on the left. Roxy, this is just bizarre. Roxy was played by Jane Wolfe, who soon after this film moved to Sicily to study magic under Aleister Crowley and became a leading figure in his new religion. In the first version of this paper, I called it a Satan-worshipping sect, but this turns out not to be how they see themselves in the Aleister Crowley world. A certain amount can be learned about the movie from the stills reprinted in movie magazines and from accounts of the censorship. Oh. Novels don't always need a lot of annotation, but Pudd'n'head Wilson benefits from it. The most important function of the annotations, I think, is to give information about the conditions of slavery in Missouri. I've tried to illustrate things that are mentioned in the text specifically. When Roxy escapes from enslavement in Arkansas, for example, she is advertised for by a runaway slave handbill. Clemens describes it. We have this illustration, which is from the correct place and time, 1854, in Missouri. And there's never any telling where annotating Mark Twain may lead you. This is one of the maxims from Pudd'n'head Wilson's calendar. It's easy to find fault if one has that disposition. There was once a man who, not being able to find any other fault with his coal, complained that there were too many prehistoric toads in it. Well, I thought that was merely whimsical until I researched it and learned that finding prehistoric toads alive in your coal was somewhat of a 19th century thing. I know it seems unlikely. It is unlikely. But people believed this was happening. This scientific journal collected the reports, though not the evidence, for the recovery of toads and frogs in rocks and lumps of coal. Among others, it reported, quote, a large, fat toad in Derbyshire found in a compact block of sandstone, which lived for a few seconds only after its release. 7 live frogs near Pontefract in compact rock, the frogs being in separate nodular masses between the strata. 30 to 40 live young frogs found in a cavity in a block of sandstone at Shieldmuir Pit in Scotland. A live toad in a solid block of coal in the forest of Dean, etc., etc. Pudd'n'head Wilson has had several different suites of illustrations affixed to it in different editions. We have an appendix giving an overview of the topic of illustration. This contains, among other things, a sampling from the hundreds of pictures in the American first edition. That edition was illustrated with poorly drawn and typically racist caricatures, which populate the margins of every page. Not a very successful illustrating innovation. It seems likely that those pictures never had Mark Twain's approval. There is nothing about them in the correspondence between him and his publisher, and the book's production schedule was too tight for the publisher to send 400 illustrations to Clemens across the Atlantic and wait for his approval. That could have taken 3 weeks or more at the time. The illustrations in the Century magazine were by Louis Loeb on the right. They did have Clemens's approval, and they are in the new edition. Loeb's pictures are in a realistic, painterly style, which was popular in 1890s magazines. They may remind you of the illustrations in the original Sherlock Holmes publications in the Strand magazine. They have not been reprinted in an American edition since 1894. They haven't been reprinted in any edition since, I think, 1894. Before I close, I want to say that this volume couldn't have been produced without the generous support of the American public, as always, through the National Endowment for the Humanities. Like other volumes in the Mark Twain series out of UC Berkeley going back to 1967, and that's almost 60 years, folks. Is Pudd'n'head Wilson a classic of American literature? By Mark Twain's definition, a classic is a book which people praise and don't read. Pudd'n'head Wilson has been praised and dispraised, and it has been read, and it has often been left unread. That's the situation of a book people don't exactly agree about. Critics quarrel over it. Often they quarrel with it. The California edition offers new texts, new contexts, and new openings, probably, into new quarrels over Pudd'n'head Wilson. Thank you.